Hey there, and welcome to Inventing Civilization, the channel in which I explore the history of political thought and philosophy. In this episode, Confucius. Confucius, or Confucius, as we know him in the West, lived during the final days of China's spring and autumn period, some 500 years BC. It was a chapter in China's history spanning 3 centuries, during which arts, literature and philosophy had all thrived, but that period of time was coming to a close. The central authority of the Zhou kings was unraveling fast, and China slowly but surely fell apart into multiple states under the reign of competing rulers. The petty aristocrats who led these states usually had very little regard for the well-being of the common man, and they were more often than not at war with each other. Law and order were being replaced with aristocratic whimsy and chaos. Confucius then grew up in a period of time when civilization itself appeared to be breaking down. His was a China suffering under the burden of increasing uncertainty and instability. It's therefore not very surprising that a lot of Confucius's teachings harbor a strong desire to restore stability and order through virtue. We don't actually know that much about Confucius as a man. Even the oldest biographies are written a long time after his death, and they're riddled with myth and legend. Our most trustworthy source is a collection of teachings called the Analects, that were most likely written down by his disciples and their students about a century after his death. But the Analects form a relatively patchy collection of texts that are often short on context, and parts have been corrupted throughout the ages. That's forced scholars to widen their scope to other historical texts to sort of fill in the blanks, but that's of course somewhat of a perilous enterprise. Most scholars do agree, however, that Confucius descended from minor and impoverished nobility. In other words, he was poor and forced to take menial jobs, but he was also educated, which was in itself a privilege. It's a combination that would come to define him, really, a man who understood the workings of politics and the state, but who could equally relate to the struggles of the common man. We know Confucius held several minor advisory posts in government, but his ideas were usually either poorly understood or thought to be too radical to have any practical application. He would achieve his greatest accomplishments as a teacher and a philosopher. His teachings were a mixture of the basic education he had himself received as a child and his own philosophy. Through his teachings, he very deliberately equipped his disciples with both the manners and the skills that were required to mingle with the higher classes, as well as the Confucian view on governance. This made his disciples perfectly equipped to change the way China was ruled. Confucius was successful as a teacher because he was a skilled and inspiring orator. Although he was dedicated to teaching, it was not his biggest ambition. He wanted to be in a position of power from where he could begin to change the world. The fact that he failed to accomplish that remained a source of frustration throughout his entire life, and by the time he died, he considered himself a failure. First, we need to make a distinction between Confucius and Confucianism. As I said before, Confucius himself left us without any written records, and even the Analects were composed by his disciples and their students well after his death. This means Confucianism as a philosophy has grown and evolved tremendously throughout the ages as disciples and students have added their own views. At this point, we might wonder how much of modern Confucianism Confucius himself would even recognize. I'm pretty confident he'd be bewildered, possibly bemused. Now, the evolution of Confucianism spans several millennia, but before you panic, we won't be covering all of that in this video. In fact, we won't really be covering any of it at all. Instead, I'm going to limit myself to the actual teachings of Confucius himself and, considering the nature of this channel, his views on politics and the state. For Confucius, 2 principles lay at the heart of all his teachings. 1, that government existed for the well-being of the people, and 2, that those who govern should be junzi, educated in the workings of Tao. That may require some additional explaining. A junzi was a gentleman, usually of noble lineage, but always educated in 6 key disciplines: archery, charioteering, music, rites, the study of mathematics, and the study of history and literature. You could not consider yourself to be educated if you hadn't mastered at least these disciplines. You might compare that to how the aristocratic elites in Europe would be expected to be able to ride a horse, wield a sword, and read Latin. For Confucius, who himself had been educated in these 6 disciplines, this was all well and good, but ultimately insufficient. For a junzi to become a good leader, he would have to adopt something called Tao. Tao to Confucius was a way of life centered around such concepts as virtue, sincerity, and benevolence. It's based on the idea that human nature is inherently predisposed to moral civilization. Tao involves a great deal of rituals, etiquette, and protocol, but basically, Confucius believed that man was naturally inclined towards morality and benevolence, could be educated on the workings of Tao, an ethical and virtuous way of life, and should then practice Tao in ritual, moral behavior, and good government. This, altogether, would allow him to lead through example. When we put all of that together, Confucius had a vision of a state where the hereditary ruler would be surrounded by ministers, all of them junzi, who possessed the character of the highest moral order shaped by Tao. The sovereign and his ministers would lead the people through example. They conducted themselves in a respectful and benevolent manner, and in doing so would inspire the people to be as them. Confucius focused his argument on the moral integrity of the rulers, but he did not immediately contest the notion of hereditary rule, which was common at the time. There are some suggestions that seem to indicate Confucius felt that oppressive rulers might somehow be forcibly removed, but he never seems to have gone into great detail. More likely, Confucius put his trust in the leader's desire to be effective, which hinges on maintaining the people's trust and respect. In this, Confucius was likely inspired by the emphasis Chinese culture puts on family ties. The relationship between a ruler and his people was comparable to that between a father and his son. The only way a father can truly lead and teach his son is by setting a good example and by never violating his trust. This did not apply to the ministers that surrounded the sovereign. They could much more easily be appointed and removed, and they were therefore a much better target for Confucius's quiet revolution. It had been the tradition that ministers were appointed because they were members of the aristocratic families, but Confucius argued that ministers should instead be selected on the premise of their education and intellectual capacity, whether they were aristocrat or commoner. Confucius himself accepted every man he thought eager and intelligent enough among his own students, and in Confucius's view, it was in the interest of the leader to surround himself with the most capable men. Limiting the selection to a small group of aristocratic families, well, that was just nonsensical. So the Confucian model for governance features a hereditary ruler, surrounded by ministers, all of them junzi, who lead the people through example guided by Tao. Confucius believed that if the leader's desire is for good, then the people will be good. He said, "The virtue of the junzi is like wind. The virtue of the common man is like grass. Let the wind blow over the grass, and it is sure to bend." Although Confucius never acquired great power himself, his teachings have been extraordinarily influential. During his lifetime, he taught some 70 disciples, some of whom reached positions of considerable influence. But as they tried to give Confucius's teachings practical applications and pass their knowledge on to others, they ended up shaping his thoughts according to their own insight. That and the simple passage of time have had a strong impact on Confucius's legacy. Now, because Confucius never left us with a clear blueprint for rule and governance, and we've had to rely on his disciples to inform us of his teachings, his thought has been interpreted in different ways throughout the ages. Whether it was the Han Dynasty in China, Enlightenment philosophers in Europe, or the revolutionary movements in France and America, all of them have found ways to trace their own views back to Confucius. It's perhaps that very freedom of interpretation that has made sure we still continue to be fascinated by Confucius today. His emphasis on things like moral integrity, education, virtue, and sincerity have stood the test of time in any culture, no matter what the exact architecture of the state looked like. Viewed like that, it's no surprise really that there is no clear definition of Confucianism. As for Confucius himself, he was really just a man who lived in a world that appeared to be collapsing all around him, and he believed that if we would all just work a little harder to be better human beings, we just might end up living in a better society. If you'd like to learn more about Confucius, there are a number of books that you might like to consult. I'm just going to give you 3 to get you started. For those of you unfamiliar with ancient China and Confucius, the book entitled Confucius, the Man and the Myth by Hurley G. Creel is probably the best starting point. It covers Confucius and his philosophy very comprehensively and provides detailed and important background information about the world in which he lived. The book is from 1949, but the very fact that it has stood the test of time so well is testimony to its quality. If you'd like to go straight to the source and read the Analects, I recommend the translation by D.C. Lau from 1979. It combines a solid translation with insightful sideline comments and helpful context. And finally, for those of you already quite confident in your knowledge of Confucius and Confucianism, you might still learn something new if you read the book The Original Analects, Sayings of Confucius and His Successors by E. Bruce and A. Taeko Brooks. It's a translation that features extensive commentary and that reorganizes the context of the Analects by the order in which they were historically composed, which offers an interesting perspective all in itself. Well, that's it for me. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'd like to thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.